part of Mexico's crackdown on drug cartels is focusing on a religious figurine. Mexican soldiers entered this house looking for guns and drugs. They came up empty-handed, but found a clue that tells them they're on the right track. An entire room devoted to the Santa Muerte, or Death Saint. The walls are covered in framed pictures of the Grim Reaper-like figure that's become popular among Mexico's outlaws, and that's concerning law enforcement. 2 men arrested last fall in connection with 11 decapitated and burned bodies had an altar to the Death Saint in their home.
In the weeks leading up to Easter Sunday in spring of 2009, the Mexican president Felipe Calderón ordered the Mexican army to undertake a very strange mission.
On a recent night, soldiers stood guard as backhoes crushed more than 30 public shrines to the robed skeleton.
They were to help in the bulldozing and destruction of a collection of shrines and altars to a cult figure known as Santa Muerte. Clothed in a dark hood with the bony face of a skeleton, the haunting figures are often depicted holding a large sickle in one hand and a crystal globe in the other. Even though the figure is frequently referred to as Saint Death by English speakers, Santa Muerte has no direct affiliation with the Catholic Church. In fact, church leaders have actively condemned devotion to it.
Probably seen it in store windows all over town. Very popular in Mexico, the skeletal saint known as Santa Muerte. And she's taking some heat from the Vatican.
But the reason why the Mexican military became involved is because beyond its spiritual implications, the cult of Santa Muerte became a dark fixture of narco culture.
Mexican cartels and gangs are praying to her for protection from law enforcement. Almonte's concern is for law enforcement because she's associated with violence.
She represented that.
President Calderón's move to publicly destroy the shrines was a message to the cartels. No one, not even your idols, are safe from his crackdown. However, in the decade and a half since then, not only have the cartels grown in power, but the cult of Santa Muerte is now one of the fastest growing religious movements in the world.
Despite the Vatican's denouncement, don't expect these skeletal statues to disappear anytime soon.
This is the story of how the folk religious movement became the cartel's favorite cult. Thanks to her affiliation with cartels and the famous opening scene of season 3 Breaking Bad, which shows cartel hitmen crawling on their bellies to worship her shrine, Santa Muerte has entered mainstream consciousness. However, before she became a sort of spiritual cartel queen, Santa Muerte was an early example of a concept known as religious syncretism.
Well, her origin, she's basically the result of what we call religious syncretism. As part and parcel of the conquest and colonization of the Americas, the Spanish Church, Catholic Church, brings over the figure of the Grim Reaperess. And I'm saying Reaperess because in Mediterranean Europe, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, more often than not, our male Grim Reaper was a female Grim Reaperess.
That's academic Dr. Andrew Chestnut, one of the world's leading experts on Santa Muerte. He is a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University and the author of the book Devoted to Death, Santa Muerte, the Skeleton Saint. He spent years studying the movement's origins that date back to early Catholic missionaries to Mexico.
And so the church brings over this representation, this personification of death, because they have no idea who the indigenous people of the Americas are, right? They're not in the Bible. And have no idea that, some of them have very sophisticated religious systems and actual death deities, such as the Aztec death goddess Mictlantecuhtli. So when the indigenous people of Mexico and Guatemala and other places in the Americas first see the Spanish Grim Reaperess, who's represented, as a skeletal figure with a scythe, they obviously make the obvious association, the natural association, with their own death deities. And so thus is born out of this syncretism of the Spanish Catholic Grim Reaperess and Mesoamerican death deities, the figure of Santa Muerte. In Spain and Europe, the Grim Reaper and Grim Reaper was not a supernatural figure. It was a mere artistic representation of death that surfaces during the Black Plague of the 14th century that kills an estimated 1/3 Europeans. And so the big difference here is the European Grim Reaperess becomes a supernatural miracle-working figure here in the Americas. The first mention in Mexico is in the records of the Catholic Inquisition in the 1790s, when a couple times inquisitors from Mexico City are called out to check on rumors that Chichimec indigenous people from the present day states of Guanajuato and Querétaro are worshiping a skeletal figure that they're calling Santa Muerte. The rumors happen to be true, and the inquisitors punish the indigenous people, smash the skeletal idols, and then Santa Muerte disappears from the Mexican historical record all the way up until the 1940s.
As he explains, the early version of Santa Muerte was an amalgamation of the Grim Reaper and Aztec gods. But by the 1940s, she became a religious movement all to her own.
American anthropologists reporting in several places in Mexico, I think most importantly in the states of Oaxaca, southern states of Oaxaca and Guerrero, where Acapulco is, that women in black are petitioning this skeletal saint called Santa Muerte exclusively for miracles and favors of love magic, mostly for boyfriends and husbands who are either imagined or really are behaving badly or cheating on them. And so they're asking Santa Muerte to bring back their errant husbands or boyfriends with the threat of her taking her oversized side and forcibly bringing them back humbled at their knees. And so from the 1940s to the 1980s, we exclusively have first American and then later Mexican anthropologists finding Santa Muerte throughout the Mexican Republic. And from that period, she's exclusively working love magic, nothing else.
Though the folk religious figure was initially seen as a spiritual force that could solve romantic problems, in the 1980s, things took a darker turn.
We start to see a connection being made between Santa Muerte and organized crime. A famous Mexican kidnapper by the name of Moche Orejas, the ear chopper, was arrested in Cuernavaca, Mexico, after kidnapping scores of victims. He was called the ear chopper because he would often send their severed ear to the family members trying to seek ransom. When he finally was arrested in Cuernavaca, he asked the authorities to bring his statue of Santa Muerte with him to the prison in which he was being incarcerated.
Santa Muerte shrines slowly began making their way into criminals' homes, but in 2001, a small-time quesadilla vendor inadvertently brought Santa Muerte to the masses.
Officials are warning of a widespread cybersecurity attack.
Frustrations and delays have continued as countless are still without power.
Market volatility is at its highest since the pandemic.
There are a number of reports across the state.
Unidentified crash. There is no doubt our grid is at risk.
– 2001 is a monumental year because the quesadilla vendor from one of the most notorious barrios of Mexico City, known as Tepito, on Halloween in 2001, decides to set out her life-size statue of Santa Muerte out onto her sidewalk. This had been gifted by one of her sons who was in prison because he got an early release from prison. And neighbors and passersby who would buy her quesadillas would spontaneously see the life-size effigy of Santa Muerte and make offerings of flowers and chocolate and tequila. And her small little quesadilla kitchen got so crowded that it caught on fire several times. So that's why she decided, I better put the statue outside, otherwise I'm gonna lose my home to a conflagration. And so that unintentional move of putting her life-size effigy out on the sidewalk marks the beginning of the transition from what was a cult clandestine practice, unknown to 99% of Mexicans. When I first started my research in 2009, my father and mother-in-law from the western state of Michoacan, who lived there, who were their 80s at the time, had never even heard of Santa Muerte. So the great majority of Mexicans only hear of Santa Muerte post 2001, thanks to this unintentional move by her name is Enriqueta Romero.
As Santa Muerte's popularity expanded in Mexican culture, so did the beliefs of her powers. She was no longer just seen as a spiritual figure who could help with people's relationships. Her followers believe she grants them a variety of powers.
I'd say for cartel members, 3 things. Prosperity. Gold Santa Muerte is the saint who symbolizes wealth, abundance, prosperity. So obviously, if you're a narco, you're looking for illicit riches. Protection. Protection is paramount, right? Because if you are a cartel member, imminent death is always there, right? You never know when law enforcement or rival cartels are coming after you. So asking her to protect you with both her scythe and her black mantle, her black robe, are an imperative aspect for narcos. And also going on the offense and neutralizing rival narcos and law enforcement. In fact, there's even a candle, a black candle called Muerte contra mis enemigos, death to my enemies, which you can buy at all kinds of botanicas across Mexico and here in the United States. So protection, neutralizing enemies, and abundance and wealth.
Because Santa Muerte followers believe she can grant protections, particularly favorable to cartel members, she became a popular staple of narco culture. Even though not all narcos count themselves as believers, she does, however, have a unique appeal to outlaws.
The unity of prayer, the unity of worship of Santa Muerte is misunderstood, right? It's very much a personal choice. It's not that narcos force it's not the cartels force narcos to be members of Santa Muerte, or it's a whole package of economic and religious and social upheaval that leads to people who are growing up in a Catholic faith to look for something that they feel is non-judgmental, a figure that they feel doesn't ask of them to conform with what the Catholic Church wants them to be.
That's crime investigative journalist and World of Crime think tank founder Chris Dolby. As he explains, unlike traditional Catholicism, Santa Muerte offers believers a non-judgmental belief system that doesn't prohibit criminal activity.
The Santa Muerte appeal is part of a package where the promise of the Catholic Church has sort of been eroded, where to be part of that society, to be accepted by that edifice that is the Catholic Church, you have to conform socially, you have to conform sexually, you have to conform economically. In many parts of Latin America, the shows of worship are associated with shows of wealth, right? You're also in a part of the world where the Catholic Church has never been able to completely detach itself from other forms of worship, whether those be Mayan, Aztec, Afro-Caribbean, Santeria in Brazil, which the Catholic Church considers to be cults. But especially in lower socioeconomic backgrounds, those forms of worship are blended with Catholic beliefs to make something really new and something really unique. Now, the Santa Muerte is at its foundation, it's not a cult of death, even though it is at its basic simplification is the Grim Reaper in a Catholic form. It's not a worship that revolves around death, that revolves around crime or violence. It is a holy figure that offers protection and demands nothing but worship in return. It doesn't demand that you live your life a certain way. It doesn't demand that you conform to certain forms of worship. And it's popular with narcos, but it's popular with others as well. It's not a narco cult. It is a religious figure that is popular in poorer, economically disadvantaged parts of Mexico originally, and it has spread to other parts of Latin America, especially Central America. And of course, a large portion of those involved in organized crime come from those backgrounds, right? From poorer communities, from more remote communities that feel disenfranchised. So they are the most public, the most vocal form of worship in Santa Muerte. And they're those with the money to create, temples to Santa Muerte, as you see in Michoacán, for example. So while narcos do often associate themselves with that cult, it's a personal choice. It's not imposed on them by a cartel. It's not imposed on them by society as the Catholic Church is. It's a deeply personal religious experience.
After Santa Muerte's explosion in popularity in the early 2000s, idols and altars began showing up during drug busts, often fueling media perception of the movement.
From there, it becomes common to be seen on tattoos, in raids on drug labs. It's an iconography on the famous tombs of the richer narcos, and you see regularly drug seizures that seize a shrine or a statue of Santa Muerte. From there, you begin to see a separation in the reality and the media perception of Santa Muerte. It's very sexy for Mexican and American news reporters to talk about this, this grim reaper cult, this cult of death that's associated to the Aztecs, that's associated with the hyper-violence of the cartels. And it is absolutely part of that, but it's a personal interpretation. If you ask 5 different drug traffickers who talk about Santa Muerte, and you ask them how they see her, they'll give you 5 different answers. So it really begins in Tepito, and it becomes convenient to have this simplified understanding of what is Santa Muerte. But if you look across Latin America, you have different saints, different figures that are similar. Narco saints, you have Jesus Malverde, most famous one probably. You have Maximon, who's a Mayan deity in Guatemala. You have San La Muerte, who's like a male version of La Santa Muerte, who's more in Paraguay, Argentina, and Uruguay. So there is a gap in the way that the Catholic Church has sort of conquered and dominated religious worship in Latin America. There is a consistent feeling among more economically disadvantaged peoples that they want something else, that they look for a different kind of figure to worship. And Santa Muerte, because of the narco culture, becomes the most famous. So it is a protective deity. It is a deity that requires nothing in return but worship. And so that leaves incredible room for interpretations. It leaves incredible room for criminals to really put their stamp on what La Santa Muerte is to them and therefore to the public.
And because there is no formal doctrine associated with the Santa Muerte cult, individual followers often put their own, sometimes very dark twists on what worshiping her looks like.
Marshal Robert Altamont teaches about Santa Muerte at police agencies across the Southwest.
Santa Muerte, I believe, is by far the most popular icon that criminals are praying to.
He says Santa Muerte is a symbol of the violence that has ravaged Mexico in recent years.
I have some cases that occurred in Mexico where people have actually sacrificed their enemy as an offering to Santa Muerte.
It's only natural that in a country as fervent and as culturally diverse, you would have these very varied forms of worship. Of course, there are sacrifices and rituals associated with Santa Muerte, but that's not because you have some cult that is demanding that. That is because some twisted person has decided that they will manifest their worship in that way. There have been altars found with fetuses in jars, next to statues of Santa Muerte. That has happened on a couple of occasions, but of course that prompts that satanic panic trend. What I would urge for people who are interested in Santa Muerte is to see this as it's a centuries-long religious and historical and cultural phenomenon that is now today translated in all sorts of ways, particularly in a country like Mexico, where the power of cartels, the power of drug traffickers is so strong, impunity is so constant that there's a feeling of detachment from usual institutions, right? Whether it be the government, whether it be the police, whether it be the Catholic Church, there's a healthy disrespect there for any form of control. And so the more flagrant, the more barbaric, let's say, manifestations of Santa Muerte worship are a extreme product of that.
It's perhaps because the diversity of beliefs associated with the Santa Muerte that the movement has taken such strong grips within the cartel.
This is a hyper-masculine, hyper-violent culture where any show of weakness could be a death sentence. You're talking about a population of very traumatized people. We often dismiss drug traffickers and cartel members as these hyper-violent butchers, which many of them are, but you cannot live in that world and not feel a psychological backlash. And so praying to a deity that seems to understand you, that seems to protect, or at least you believe protects people in your position, which have been rejected by the Catholic Church, by the government, by the, let's say, normal society, understandably in many of ways, it is a form of comfort. And the more twisted manifestations of violence that you see in the cartels, well, some of that will inevitably be associated with Santa Muerte, because for certain individuals or certain groups, she is a representation, she is a symbolization that we can do whatever we want and we can still find a form of religious salvation.
As Santa Muerte's influence has evolved, so too has the government and law enforcement's response to it. Since President Felipe Calderón's high-profile crackdown on the movement in 2009, new administrations have taken a starkly different approach.
You have to understand who Calderón was as a president, right? Calderón answered to a very right-wing conservative electorate, which was very Catholic. And so, in a way to justify his militarization of the conflict against cartels, targeting Santa Muerte is, going after this heathen pagan interpretation, twisting of religion. It helped him, right? Because it catered to that religious base, and it helped to reinforce the image of the cartels as being other, as being outside the norms of Mexican dignified Catholic society. AMLO, the outgoing president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has actually been fairly outspoken about his religious tolerance of Santa Muerte, right? He has not been, bashing the Mexican people for straying away from the Catholic faith. He has actually defended freedom of religion in terms of Santa Muerte, and that's because López Obrador caters to a completely different electoral base. He is a man. He's seen as a man of the people. He has a voter base that is very usually economically poorer, more left wing, and so his voter base is among the communities where Santa Muerte is popular. I don't see how it would be a political advantage to anyone in Mexico to go after Santa Muerte. There's also a much better understanding of its diversity of worship than almost 20 years ago when Calderón was in power.
Public acceptance of Santa Muerte has now become mainstream, so much so that according to Dr. Chestnut, the movement now has more than 12 million followers, making it one of the fastest growing religious movements in the world.
80% of new businesses in the United States fail within a few years. It's the same for new religious movements. The great majority we never hear about because they shuttered their doors a few years ago. And so this is a great exception, and partly also because it arises at the same time that social media is taking off. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and now TikTok have been just amazing platforms for its growth and globalization. Last time I did a search a couple months ago on TikTok, get this, Santa Muerte in quotations, 2 billion hits.
The story of Santa Muerte's rapid rise expands far beyond cartels, but its influence continues to be seen in a rising generation of narcos. My name is Vince Vargas. Thank you for watching Reasonable Fear, a Borderland special series, an Ironclad original. Be sure to check out @ThisIsIronclad on YouTube for more from this series, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.